that didn't look like much, right? But when you have been a long-time observer of Parliament and you know how the House of Commons is supposed to work, it looks a lot like this. To my eye, there is so much wrong with that clip. Oh my god. So much wrong. Like, ass-to-mouth donkey show levels of wrongness. However, I wasn't going to make a video on it because I kind of figured it would be chalked up to a radar blip and we would all move on. Not the case. I investigated the mainstream media, and the aspects of this that are being reported on are completely missing the fucking point. This is not a domestic violence issue. This is not a partisan issue. It is a competence issue and a respect for the institution of democracy of Canada issue, i.e. our House of Commons. So I think a few people need a bit of a history lesson. Most notably our toddler-in-chief, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. So for my lovely non-Canadian listeners, or even Canadians who just haven't been arsed to learn about politics, I'll give a bit of a précis as to what's happening in that clip. The MPs are on a break before they are voting on an issue. The bells have rung, signifying the MPs must take their places for the vote. There is a delay of about 30 seconds. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau takes it upon himself to cross the floor, which is a huge no-no, and take the Conservative whip Gord Brown by the arm in order to, I guess, help him to his seat and expedite the process. In the process, Prime Minister Trudeau apparently accidentally elbows MP Ruth Ellen Brosseau, and here we go. Now, I'm not overly fashed by the hands-on part. Yeah, putting your hands on someone else is wrong, but I've previously alluded to an understanding that Canadian politicians have a history of well-documented personal flaws, and how Canadians generally are much more forgiving of our politicians for their personal foibles than some other countries. Jean Chrétien extended a Shawinigan handshake, that's code for a choke slam, to a protester in 1996. He was also a Liberal PM, by the way, and while he was charged, the case was dismissed. I also don't much care about the salty language Prime Minister Trudeau apparently used, dropping the F-bomb in Parliament, as while people have been expelled from Parliament for, quote, unparliamentary language, unquote, it just doesn't bother me personally. I'm more concerned with the lack of understanding of the rules of the institution he is working within. And when you observe how the press is reporting on this, they're largely reporting on MP Ruth Ellen Brosseau, a woman, as being assaulted. However, the real target of this assault was Conservative Party whip Gord Brown, who was a man. Just file that away. That it's apparently really awful when a female gets elbowed in the chest, but not so bad, apparently, that the Prime Minister of fucking Canada puts his hands on the male whip to the point that the whip has to tell him to let go. Who was the target again? Oh yeah, the man. Gord Brown. Gord Brown. Just repeating his name because he's the real fucking target. Moving on, if this frisson had happened outside of Parliament, I would still count it as unprofessional and unstatesmanly, but it wouldn't have gotten under my skin the same way. No, what prompted this video was what I consider the real attack, which is on the backbone of my beloved country itself, our Parliament. Trudeau did this in Parliament, a sacred institution that every Canadian who has enjoyed the relative peace of the last 100 or so years owes a debt to. Because before Parliament, we were fucked dry in every hole. Our country is only about 150 years old. Before Parliament, you had the Upper Canada and Lower Canada Division, and the rebellions of 1837, I think, and then the Fenian raids in the late 1800s, mid to late 1860... Come on, Trebek, help me. 66. And then the Métis uprisings of the Northwest Rebellion in 1870... 1875, 6, I don't know. But we also had the assassination of D'Arcy McGee in late April of 1868, and he was assassinated for supporting Canada over the Fenians. This is getting mucky, but what I'm saying is, we are not a peaceful country, but for our parliament. I'm going to try really hard not to turn this into wah 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 wah, but I'm not sure it can be appreciated how important Parliament is unless you have a bit of context for its history. Its why, and how without it Canada would have gone tits up long ago. I'm going to be speaking generally here without a ton of citations, but if you have any issue with my assertions or dates, please take them up with me in the comments, and we'll throw down. Come at me, brah. Even when I don't cite things explicitly, I do a ton of fact-checking and research before I make videos, and I have all these things in the mental ammunition cache. Thank you, Teal Deer. So, a lot of people seem to have this idea that Canadians are a peaceful, pussy, polite society. Oh no, 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 just no. We are built on blood and conflict, just as I'd say any other non-homogeneous nation is. Canada is the original diversity project. Original inhabitants are First Nations who, don't be fooled, fought each other and committed genocide against each other, just as later European colonists were accused of doing to them. Yep, you can look up how the first Far North inhabitants were replaced by their modern Inuit bloodline yourself. No whites needed. Then you had explorers like John Cabot, an Italian working for the English, and the Norse. Then we had the boom in oceanographic technology, and we had the Portuguese, and finally the French. So, the landscape of Canada in the 1500s was a population of native peoples and small pockets of colonization. The French took the lead in this, and ended up establishing New France and a booming fur trade, followed closely by the British, who really started pushing for the reins in the late 1600s and early 1700s. Lots of wars in here. French and Indian, Acadian conflicts. The Acadians were French colonists who mixed with the indigenous Canadian population and developed their own distinct culture. Basically an English versus French throwdown of epic proportions, like deathmatch proportions. France gave over its dominion in Canada to the British with only a few caveats, so now Canada was essentially fully British, but with an understanding that French culture that had developed had to be more or less preserved. So, 1700s, American Revolution, which made Canada the de facto enemy of the new American colonies, although there was some pushback here as well, with many Canadian sympathizers against British rule. So the Americans invaded Canada, and while the Americans failed to take Quebec, a series of later British defeats eventually led to the Treaty of Paris in 1783. So a kind of uneasy truce happened with Canada's southernmost areas following the Treaty of Paris. But of course the War of 1812 was on the horizon, and Canada was this giant clusterfuck of competing interests and First Nations fucking off and doing their own thing, except for Tecumseh, who is solid. But we, well, the British, won that particular conflict, but it was bloody. It was every man for himself at this point, and a crucial hinge point in Canada's history. It took several treaties and a lot of negotiation to try to get us back to some semblance of peace. But we managed it after the Napoleonic Wars, and in the 1800s a huge influx of immigrants from the UK, notably Scottish and Irish, for their own reasons, which I'm not going to get into, but they settled here in Canada. So, to recap, pre-Confederation, we had First Nations fighting each other and fighting the Europeans, though that more or less settled after the Treaty of Paris, with the new establishment of the Métis as fighting for independent power. We had the Irish, Scottish, and English with their own historical differences. We had the French. We had Americans. We had the Acadians. So we were a country full of different and opposing cultures with historical bones to pick and competing resource needs. It was a powder keg ready to explode into more wars. So the Fathers of Confederation came up with some rules for us all becoming one dominion with a common Canadian identity. Under the Crown, yes, but distinct and recognizing British, American, First Nations, and French interests. It wasn't perfect, and had to be refined many times, sometimes in the wake of yet more bloodshed, But in the late to mid-1800s, the first Canadian Parliament, which took all of its traditions from British Parliament and had fought for 600 years since the Magna Carta to become independent of the Crown and authoritarian and bully rule, came into session as a peaceful and regulated means for all of these different interests to have their say. Democracy, yo! You watch the House of Commons today, and it can seem super dry and boring. But think back. Parliament was founded in a time when almost everyone was armed, and they were meeting in a room with people they literally wanted to slaughter where they stood. That's why rules were established about not crossing the floor, not touching the mace. Parliament still has a sergeant-at-arms with access to loaded firearms for this very reason. It's not just to protect Parliament from outside threats. It's also to keep the peace within the walls, non-partisan, if people got rowdy. And Parliament is one of the only establishments in Canada that can explicitly keep out the Crown, that is, the Queen or King. They can keep them out of the parlaying for the people. That's where the whole Black Rod and Upper Chambers practices came in. The Parliament is really the people's forum, the free democratic people's forum. And this is why what Justin Trudeau did counts so heavily against him as a statesman, a politician, and a leader. It is a black mark he will never be able to fully shed. It wasn't the manhandling. It was the total ignorance of why respecting parliamentary conduct is necessary for the democratic process of Canada. He crossed the floor. He physically seized his opposition. This is gross misconduct for what is the most sacred institution in Canadian democracy. And this is Canada's fucking Prime Minister. And maybe this behavior is a reflection of Obama's pen and phone phenomenon. You know, fuck the police and do what you want. It's like South Park. It's my hot body. I do what I want. Maybe this is a reflection of Michelle Obama's touching the Queen, which didn't do any harm but still caused a collective gasp from those who understand the sanctity of the royal person. You just don't do that. But I don't much fucking care. Decorum crosses partisan lines. Understanding of the rules crosses partisan lines. And I would be as disgusted by this behavior if Trudeau was Conservative or NDP, because it takes a big, steaming Cleveland dump on the very system designed to represent all interests in democratic process. I can't rag on the US, though. Even the UK, the cradle of Canada's parliamentary system, is decaying. Just look at the recent incidents of Michael Gove turning his back on the Queen. A huge no-no that I literally gasped at when I saw the video, because this is not done. Decorum and protocol in general are falling by the wayside. But I would argue that these seemingly small measures, small courtesies, represent a greater respect and understanding of the processes that keep our cultures moving forward and not being dragged back into intimidation and violent practices. This kind of decorum is seen in our courts, our school boards, and our parliament. They are there for a reason. So, Mr. Trudeau, your true crime was not just in putting your hands on the Conservative whip or elbowing Brosseau. Your crime was showing how little patience, understanding of, humility, and respect for the Canadian process of legislature you have. You seek the power you are given in our parliament, but you show no respect for the very institution that gives you that power. You are not 1/10 the man your father was, and that is truly damning with faint praise. Leave politics to the grown-ups. And shame on you for pissing on the body that is supposed to ensure Canada's disparate groups have representation. Because by doing so, you are pissing on all that is Canadian, democratic, and me. I am embarrassed for you, and I am embarrassed Canada elected you. Your handlers will only be able to apologize for you so long before even the staunchest partisan Liberal progressives are equally embarrassed and turn their backs on you. Oh, and for the record, I don't buy that this was a loss of control at all. I think this was a deliberate move to swagger, to unzip in the middle of Parliament and walk around with your cock out to show people that you're not afraid. You're a rebel. You can break the rules because you're Justin fucking Trudeau. It's the same way as lawyers that you see will bring up points and then immediately say, oh, well, withdrawn. But they've already poisoned the jury, haven't they? You are making a mockery of our Parliament. And I can't sit by and let that happen, even if all I can do is make a video.